August 8, 1942, Geneva, Switzerland, in a cramped office overlooking Lake Geneva. Gerhard Rigner's hands trembled as he held a piece of paper that would change history. The World Jewish Congress representative had just received information from a German industrialist, intelligence so horrifying that he'd spent days trying to convince himself it couldn't be true. The Nazis, according to his source, were planning to murder every Jew in occupied Europe. 3.5 to 4 million people. All at once. The method: prussic acid. Zyklon B. Rigner walked to the American consulate, where Vice Consul Howard Elting noted he arrived on great agitation. The telegram Rigner dictated that day would reach London. It would reach New York. It would eventually reach the desk of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself. But the truth contained in those words, the systematic annihilation of European Jewry, would be met not with immediate action, but with skepticism, bureaucratic delay, and calculated suppression. This is the story of what America knew about the Holocaust, when we knew it, and the agonizing question that haunts us still: why did we do so little? The knowledge didn't begin in 1942. It began the moment Adolf Hitler rose to power. January 30, 1933, the New York Times, along with newspapers across America, reported Hitler's appointment as Chancellor of Germany. Within weeks, stories emerged about new laws targeting Jews, about the establishment of Dachau concentration camp, about violence spreading through German streets like a disease. This wasn't hidden, this was news. March 1933, Madison Square Garden in New York City filled with 55,000 people for a mass anti-Nazi rally. They knew, American Jews knew. The question was, would anyone listen? Would anyone care? As the 1930s unfolded, the whispers became a steady stream. Refugees fleeing Germany brought stories of persecution, of businesses destroyed, of neighbors who turned into tormentors overnight. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935, stripping Jews of citizenship and basic rights, made front-page news across America. When Kristallnacht shattered the windows of Jewish shops and synagogues in November 1938, American newspapers carried graphic descriptions of the violence. But knowing and understanding are different things. Knowing and acting are separated by an even greater chasm. The American public in the 1930s was not ignorant of Nazi antisemitism. They were skeptical, they were wary, they remembered the propaganda of World War I, the stories of German atrocities that had later proven exaggerated or false. They were suspicious of reports that seemed too extreme to be true. And beneath this skepticism lay something darker, a pervasive anti-Semitism that infected American society like poison in the bloodstream. In 1938, a Fortune magazine poll revealed that over half of Americans believed Jews had too much power in business. Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest, reached millions of listeners every week with broadcasts accusing Jews of conspiring to control the world. In the halls of the State Department, in the offices of newspaper publishers, in the minds of ordinary Americans, there existed a readiness to dismiss Jewish suffering, to minimize Jewish claims, to look away from Jewish fate. The refugees who managed to reach American shores carried testimonies in their voices and scars on their souls. They told of camps, of beatings, of a systematic stripping away of human dignity. Jewish organizations compiled reports. Synagogues held prayer services. But the machinery of American indifference had already begun to turn. May 1939, the SS St. Louis, a German ocean liner, sailed from Hamburg, carrying 1937 passengers. Nearly all were Jews fleeing the Third Reich. They had Cuban landing certificates. They had hope. Cuba refused them entry. The ship approached the Florida coast, so close that passengers could see the lights of Miami glowing in the darkness. The United States refused them entry. Canada refused them entry. The St. Louis was forced to return to Europe. More than 250 of those passengers would eventually die in the Holocaust. They could see America. They could almost touch salvation. But the door was closed. The architect of that closed door had a name: Breckinridge Long. Samuel Breckinridge Long was Assistant Secretary of State, a patrician from Kentucky horse breeding aristocracy, a man who saw himself as defending America from foreign infiltration. In June 1940, he wrote a memo to his colleagues that would seal the fate of thousands. We can delay and effectively stop for a temporary period of indefinite length, the number of immigrants into the United States. We could do this by simply advising our consuls to put every obstacle in the way, and to require additional evidence, and to resort to various administrative devices, which would postpone and postpone and postpone the granting of the visas. Postpone. The bureaucratic euphemism for death, long instituted, security checks, that he claimed would prevent Nazi spies from infiltrating with the refugees. Despite no evidence that refugees posed such risks, he created the relatives rule, requiring any applicant with family in German, Russian, or Italian territory to pass nearly impossible security tests. The visa application form became 8 feet long, printed in small type, a labyrinth designed to trap rather than guide. During American involvement in the war, 90% of quota places available to immigrants from countries under German and Italian control went unfilled. If those quotas had been filled, 190,000 additional people could have escaped, 190,000 lives that Breckinridge Long's postponement surrendered to the gas chambers. President Roosevelt knew. In a 1930, he acknowledged that nearly all immigration quotas have been considerably under-issued during the past 4 years. He cited the year-by-year statistics, yet he allowed the policy to continue. At a press conference in June 1940, Roosevelt himself falsely claimed that some refugees, especially Jewish refugees, might be Nazi spies, their families held hostage to ensure cooperation. The president who would later be remembered as a champion of the oppressed was, on this issue, complicit in their abandonment. September 1939, war erupted across Europe. As German tanks rolled into Poland, as the Wehrmacht conquered nation after nation, Jews found themselves trapped behind walls of wire and walls of indifference. The Nazis established ghettos in Warsaw, in Lodz, in dozens of cities. They forced hundreds of thousands of people into cramped quarters where starvation and disease became weapons as effective as bullets. Reports reached America. The State Department received cables from diplomats. Jewish organizations compiled evidence, but the dominant response was silence punctuated by doubt. In the back pages of American newspapers, page 7, page 12, buried between advertisements for soap and pianos, small articles appeared. Warsaw fears extermination. Read one headline in the New York Times on July 29, 1942. Not front page, not urgent. Just a handful of paragraphs suggesting that something terrible might be happening, somewhere far away, to people most Americans would never meet. August 8, 1942. Gerhard Riegner's telegram represented the first authoritative confirmation that the Nazis had a coordinated plan for total annihilation. The telegram stated, received alarming report about plan being discussed and considered in F. Heer headquarters to exterminate at one fell swoop Jews in German-controlled countries comprising 3.5 to 4 million, after deportation and concentration in the East, thus solving Jewish quotation wanting for all stop campaign planned for ultimatum to methods being discussed, including adrenocyanic acid. For American State non-deportment. Upon receiving this telegram, refused to forward it to its intended recipient, Rabbi Stephen Wise, president of the World Jewish Congress and a close associate of President Roosevelt. State Department officials called it a wild rumor, fueled by Jewish anxieties. They cited the fantastic nature of the allegation and the impossibility of our being of any assistance if such action were taken. Minister Leland Harrison, Washington's highest-ranking diplomat in Switzerland, warned that Riegner's message was likely just another war rumor inspired by fear. 3 weeks later, when Rabbi Wise finally received the telegram through British channels, the State Department asked him to keep it quiet until they could verify the information. Wise complied. For 3 months, while trains rolled toward Treblinka and Sobibor and Belzec, while thousands died each day, Wise waited for official confirmation. November 1942, the State Department finally confirmed what Riegner reported. Wise held a press conference. Newspapers across America published variations of his announcement, but mostly on inside pages, treated as one story among many in a world at war. December 6, 1942, became an international day of mourning in Jewish communities worldwide. Synagogues held services. Businesses closed. Over 1,500 American synagogues participated, but the news received minimal newspaper coverage. As historian Yehuda Bauer documented, the horror was reported. The horror was ignored. Then came Jan Karski, a young Polish resistance fighter, courier for the Polish government. In exile, Karski had been smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto twice in 1942. Disguised as an Estonian guard, he infiltrated a transit camp near Belzec. What he witnessed defied comprehension. Emaciated people packed into cattle cars, guards beating them with rifle butts, screams that seemed to come from hell itself. Hunger, thirst, fear, and exhaustion had driven them all insane. Karski would later write, Jewish leaders in Warsaw begged him to carry their testimony to the West. Tell the leaders, they said, that we are dying. Tell them that human beings are being destroyed. Karski traveled under an assumed identity to London, where he met with British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, delivering his eyewitness account. Eden listened politely. Then Karski journeyed to America. July 28, 1943, the Oval Office. Jan Karski sat across from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the most powerful man in the world. For over an hour, Karski described what he had seen. He spoke of the ghetto, of the transit camp, of the systematic murder of an entire people. Roosevelt asked about Polish horses. He asked about Polish agriculture. He asked about Polish politics. He asked Karski almost nothing about the Jews. Karski also met with Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, himself Jewish, a close friend and advisor to Roosevelt. After listening to Karski's detailed testimony, Frankfurter stood and paced the room. Then he spoke words that capture the chasm between knowledge and belief. Mr. Karski, a man like me talking to a man like you must be totally frank. So I must say, I am unable to believe in what I have just heard, in all the things that you have just told me. The Polish ambassador, present at the meeting, was stunned. Felix, what are you talking about? He is not lying. Frankfurter clarified. I did not say he was lying. I said I cannot believe him. There is a difference. There is a difference. Between hearing and believing. Between knowing and accepting. Between information and action. The truth had broken through. The truth had reached the highest levels of Allied leadership. But the truth encountered a wall more impenetrable than barbed wire. The inability to imagine that such evil could be real, combined with the unwillingness to prioritize Jewish lives over military strategy. While Karski's testimony circulated among the powerful, while newspapers published sporadic stories about atrocities, Breckinridge Long and his colleagues at the State Department worked with remarkable efficiency, not to save lives, but to prevent rescue. In February 1943, the State Department instructed its legation in Switzerland to discontinue sending reports about the mass murder of Jews to private persons in the US. When the Swiss continued to send information anyway, State Department officials buried it. Long's diary reveals his mindset. He described Hitler's Mein Kampf as eloquent in opposition to Jewry and Jews as exponents of communism and chaos. He saw himself besieged by communists, extreme radicals, Jewish professional agitators, and refugee enthusiasts, who were all woven together in the barrage of opposition against the State Department. In his view, he was protecting America. In reality, he was enabling genocide. April 1943, Gerhard Riegner proposed a plan to save thousands of French and Romanian Jews. The plan had support, it had funding, it had a realistic chance of success. Breckinridge Long and his subordinates delayed acting on it for 8 months. 8 months during which the murder continued, uninterrupted. October 1943, 400 Orthodox rabbis marched to the White House to present a petition calling for a rescue agency. President Roosevelt declined to meet them, declined to even acknowledge their presence. November 1943, Congress considered a resolution to establish a government rescue agency. Long testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, claiming that 580,000 refugees had been admitted to the United States since Hitler came to power, and that most were Jewish. This was false. The actual numbers were far lower, and Long deliberately inflated them to suggest America had done enough. A Treasury Department official would later characterize Long and his colleagues as an American underground movement to let the Jews be killed. Then something broke through the bureaucratic fortress. Treasury Department staff, investigating the blocked funds for Romanian Jews, discovered the full scope of State Department obstruction. 3 officials, Josiah Dubois Jr., Randolph Paul, and John Pell, compiled their findings into a report initially titled, Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews. The report was damning. Officials in our State Department, which is charged with carrying out this policy, have been guilty not only of gross procrastination and willful failure to act, but even of willful attempts to prevent action from being taken to rescue Jews from Hitler. The report concluded with a moral indictment. If men of the temperament and philosophy of Long continue in control of immigration administration, we may as well take down that plaque from the Statue of Liberty and black out the lamp beside the Golden Door. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., the highest-ranking Jewish official in Roosevelt's inner circle, presented a revised version directly to the president. Morgenthau warned that the refugee issue had become a boiling pot on Capitol Hill, and Congress was likely to pass the rescue resolution unless the White House acted first. Roosevelt, facing both moral pressure and political calculation in an election year, preempted Congress. On January 22, 1944, 17 months after the Regner telegram, 18 months after systematic reports of mass murder began reaching Washington, he signed Executive Order 90417, establishing the War Refugee Board. It was charged with the immediate rescue and relief of the Jews of Europe and other victims of enemy persecution. By then, more than 5 million European Jews had already been murdered. The War Refugee Board, led by John Peel and operating with a staff never exceeding 30 people, worked with remarkable creativity despite inadequate funding and bureaucratic resistance. They pressured neutral countries to accept refugees. They hired Raoul Wallenberg and sent him to Budapest, where he saved tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews. They facilitated the rescue of 600 Jews from Bergen, Belsen through ransom negotiations. They brought 982 refugees to a camp in Oswego, New York. Historians estimate the board saved between 100,000 and 200,000 lives, a remarkable achievement, but Pell himself called it little and late. Little compared to the scope of the Holocaust. Late because by the time the board was created, the Nazis had already murdered the majority of their eventual victims. Gerhard Rigner, who sent that first telegram in 1942, wrote in his memoirs, "Since my first telegram, 18 months had passed, during which time the inexorable massacre, etc., continued, and millions of Jews were sacrificed. Never did I feel so strongly the sense of abandonment, powerlessness and loneliness, as when I sent messages of disaster and horror to the free world, and no one believed me." April 4, 1945, soldiers of the U.S. 4th Armored Division and 89th Infantry Division entered Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald. They were not prepared for what they found. Bodies stacked like cordwood. A burned pyre with charred human remains. A shed containing roughly 30 emaciated corpses, sprinkled with lime in a futile attempt to mask the smell. Survivors so skeletal they seemed barely human. Walking corpses with eyes that had seen hell. Private David Cohen would later say, "We walked into a shed, and the bodies were piled up like wood." There are no words to describe it. The smell was overpowering and unforgettable. April 12, 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe, arrived at Ohrdruf with Generals George S. Patton and Omar Bradley. What they witnessed on that spring day would define their understanding of what they had been fighting against. A survivor demonstrated the torture methods used by SS guards. Another survivor showed them the gallows. They walked past the piles of bodies. Patton, a man who had witnessed the worst violence of war, refused to enter one building. The sights and smells had already caused him to vomit against the side of a building. Eisenhower later wrote to General George C. Marshall, "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. I made the visit deliberately, in order to be in position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." Eisenhower ordered something unprecedented. He demanded that American troops, not in combat, be brought to witness the camps. He requested that members of Congress and prominent newspaper editors be flown to Europe to see the evidence with their own eyes. He required German civilians from nearby towns to tour the camps and bury the dead. We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Eisenhower declared, "Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against." When journalists asked Eisenhower in June 1945 whether publishing stories and photographs of concentration camps had been wise, he responded simply, "I think people ought to know about such things." The liberation continued. Buchenwald on April 11, Dachau on April 29, Mauthausen on May 5. At each camp, American soldiers encountered the same horrifying reality: emaciated prisoners, piles of corpses, evidence of torture and systematic murder on an industrial scale. Correspondent Edward R. Murrow broadcast from Buchenwald on April 15, his voice breaking as he described the inhumane conditions. "I pray you to believe what I have said about Buchenwald. I have reported what I saw and heard, but only part of it. For most of it I have no words." The American public, which had heard scattered reports for years, suddenly confronted undeniable photographic evidence. Newsreels showed the liberation. Magazines published photographs. The horror that had been buried on page 7, dismissed as exaggeration, minimized as wartime propaganda, it all became real, unavoidable, impossible to deny. But the photographs raised a terrible question. If this was the reality, why hadn't America done more? During the war, the New York Times had published approximately first 200 articles about what we now call the Holocaust. About one every other day, but only 26 of those stories appeared on the front page out of 23,000 total front page articles published between 1939 and 1945. The story of systematic genocide, the greatest crime of the 20th century, was consistently buried in the back pages between advertisements for soap and pianos. Publisher Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, himself Jewish, had feared that emphasizing Jewish suffering would make the Times appear to be a special pleader for the Jews. He worried about feeding American anti-Semitism. He was paranoid, with justification, about the paper being marginalized because of its Jewish ownership. So the paper that had more information than any other American newspaper, the paper whose correspondents sent detailed reports from Europe, the paper that President Roosevelt read every morning, that paper chose to minimize the story of the Holocaust while it was happening. Other newspapers followed the Times's lead. If America's most important newspaper wasn't treating this as front-page news, why should they? The Nuremberg trials, beginning in November 1945, would eventually document the full scope of Nazi crimes, but by then, 6 million Jews were dead, millions of others, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, Soviet abutters, homosexuals, had been murdered. The evidence was undeniable. The guilt was established. The world said, "Never again." But the question remained, what about the guilt of those who knew and did nothing? America did not cause the Holocaust. The responsibility for that crime belongs to Nazi Germany and its collaborators. But America's response, the closed doors, the bureaucratic delays, the suppressed information, the minimized coverage, represents a moral failure that demands acknowledgement. We knew about Kristallnacht in 1938, we knew about the ghettos in 1940, we knew about systematic murder by 1942, we knew the details, the gas chambers, the death camps, the industrial scale of killing, by 1943 at the latest. Yet we did almost nothing until 1944, when most of the victims were already dead. The reasons are complex and painful. Antisemitism infected American society at every level. Bureaucrats like Breckinridge long placed national security paranoia above humanitarian concern. Newspaper publishers feared appearing to advocate for Jewish causes. Politicians calculated that the American public cared more about military victory than about rescuing Jews. Military leaders insisted that bombing death camps would divert resources from the war effort. Underneath all these specific reasons lay a more fundamental truth. Jewish lives, to most Americans and their leaders, simply didn't matter enough. Historians still debate how many could have been saved. If America had filled its immigration quotas, perhaps 190,000 more refugees could have escaped before the borders closed completely. If the War Refugee Board had been created in 1942 instead of 1944, perhaps hundreds of thousands more could have been rescued. If American newspapers had treated the Holocaust as front-page news, perhaps public pressure would have forced earlier action. We cannot know the precise numbers, but we know this more could have been done. More should have been done. The information was available. The means, if not always easy, were possible. What was lacking was the will, the willingness to prioritize the lives of people being murdered simply because they were Jewish. Gerhard Riegner lived until 2001, haunted by the knowledge that his telegram, sent in August 1942, could have saved millions if it had been believed, if it had been acted upon. Jan Karski taught at Georgetown University for 40 years, rarely speaking about his wartime mission, until the 1980s, still wondering if he had done enough to make the world listen. John Peel called the War Refugee Board's work little and late, a judgment that would echo through the decades. The survivors, those who lived through the camps and emerged into a world that had failed to save them, carried a different burden: the knowledge that the world had known, that help could have come, that it came too late for their parents, their children, their siblings, their communities. This is not a story with heroes who can redeem it. There are individuals who acted with courage. The diplomats who issued protective papers, the officials who defied orders, the journalists who insisted on truth. But they were too few, acting against too much institutional resistance, opposed by too many who chose bureaucracy over humanity. This is a story of what happens when knowledge exists without action, when information encounters indifference, when truth is buried beneath prejudice and political calculation. As we remember the Holocaust, as we say, never again, we must also remember this: the phrase is meaningless unless we learn from what happened when the world knew genocide was occurring and chose to do so little. The machinery of denial, of bureaucratic obstruction, of prioritizing other concerns over stopping mass murder, all of it can happen again. Is happening again, in other places, to other people. The question the Holocaust poses to America is not merely historical. It is moral and contemporary. When we know atrocity is occurring, when we have the power to act, when human beings are being systematically destroyed. What will we choose? Will we find excuses? Will we minimize? Will we bury the story on page 7? Or will we remember what American soldiers found when they opened the gates of Ohrdruf and Buchenwald and Dachau, and recognize that the cost of inaction is measured in mass graves and unfilled promises? The Holocaust happened because the Nazis chose murder, but it reached the scale it did partly because the world, including America, chose to know without acting, to see without believing, to hear the screams of the dying, and respond with silence. That is the uncomfortable truth of American awareness of the Holocaust. We knew early. We knew with increasing clarity and detail as the war progressed. And we did too little, too late, for too many who could have been saved. If this story has moved you, if it has made you remember names that time tried to erase, faces that deserve to be seen, voices that should have been heard, then subscribe and help us keep their legacy alive. Because remembering what happened is our duty, but remembering why it happened, and why so few acted to stop it, is how we prevent it from happening again. The liberation of the camps was not the end of the story. It was the moment when the full weight of what was known, and what was ignored, became impossible to deny. American soldiers walked through Ohrdruf in April 1945 and asked, how did we let this happen? Eisenhower demanded documentation and witness testimony because he understood that future generations would struggle to believe such evil was real. We are those future generations, and we must believe. We must remember, and we must ask ourselves the question that haunted Gerhard Riegner, that tormented Jan Karski, that weighed on every survivor who wondered why help came so late. When the world is burning, when people are dying, when we have the power to act, what will we choose? That is the question the Holocaust poses to every generation. The answer, in 1942, in 1943, in 1944, was not good enough.